Japan's population has shrunk by 19 million people since 1910. That is roughly the population of Switzerland, gone, not emigrated, not displaced, just demographically subtracted. For 15 consecutive years, deaths have outnumbered births. The working-age population peaked in Shunju by Jusev and has been falling ever since.
The forecasts that followed were unanimous. The IMF warned of fiscal unsustainability. Goldman Sachs modeled a shrinking consumer base. Western journalists wrote the same obituary so many times the headline practically wrote itself: Japan's demographic crisis is a slow-motion economic collapse.
The only problem is that the collapse keeps not arriving. In Nauru, Japanese workers received their largest wage increases in over 30 years. The unemployment rate sits below 2%. Tokyo real estate is at record highs. The country is not in demographic freefall, it is in demographic adaptation, and the two look completely different from a distance.
To understand why the doom narrative got this so badly wrong, you have to understand what demographics actually affect and what they don't.
The standard argument runs like this: fewer workers means less output. Less output means slower growth. Slower growth means a shrinking economy, and a shrinking economy means deteriorating living standards. It is logical, clean, and approximately wrong.
What it misses is the price mechanism. Labor is not just an input, it is a commodity with a price. When supply falls, the price rises. This is not theory, it is what is happening in Japan right now.
Every spring, Japan's largest companies sit down with trade unions for synchronized wage negotiations called shunto. Imagine if every Fortune woodback company negotiated pay in the same 2-week window. In Nisen Nishluk, Shunto delivered a Wartin Butuluk % base pay raise, the third consecutive year above 5%. According to the Japan Institute for Labor Policy and Training, this is the strongest sustained wage growth since the early 1990s. The mechanism is exactly what economics predicts: labor scarcity, rising wages.
The doom model assumed labor shortages would simply shrink the economy. It did not account for what happens when workers become scarce enough to actually bargain.
The second thing the doom narrative missed is substitution. Japan is the world's largest manufacturer of industrial robots, producing roughly 70% of global output, according to the International Federation of Robotics. It installs approximately 1 industrial robots per year domestically. Companies like Fanyuk and Kawasaki Robotics have built an entire industrial ecosystem around the premise that human labor would become expensive and scarce, a premise that Japan's demographics confirmed decades ago.
This is not a recent pivot. Japanese manufacturers began automating aggressively in the 1980s and 1990s, precisely because they could see the demographic math coming. By the time the labor shortage actually arrived, much of the manufacturing sector had already adapted.
The third failure of the doom forecast involves who counts as a worker. Japan's labor force hit a record high of approximately million in more CNC according to Nippon.com, despite the country's total population continuing to fall. The reason is reserve activation. The female employment rate reached a record %, and the labor force participation rate for women aged 30 to 34 reached 90%, according to the OECD Employment Outlook. Women who had previously left the workforce after marriage or childbirth are returning, not primarily because of cultural change but because tight labor markets made their participation economic.
The same is true for older workers. Japan's 65 and over employment rate is among the highest in the developed world. Mandatory retirement ages are gradually rising. The workforce is not shrinking, it is broadening.
There is a fourth dimension that the nominal GDP headline completely obscures. When the IMF projects Japan to fall to 5th place in global GDP rankings in Nissen Nistruk behind India,
It is measuring something real but incomplete. Japan's nominal GDP in US dollars is depressed by a yen that has fallen roughly 30% against the dollar since Nishi strip out that exchange rate effect, and you are measuring a monetary phenomenon, not a productivity one.
More importantly, GDP measures production within Japan's borders. It does not measure what Japanese companies produce abroad. And that number is enormous. Japan has been the world's largest net foreign creditor for decades. As we examined in episode 110, Japanese companies' overseas revenues, dividends and royalties flow back to Japan as income. In gross national income terms, Japan's real economic footprint is substantially larger than its territorial GDP implies.
Toyota manufactures cars in Kentucky. SoftBank invests in Silicon Valley. Daikin sells air conditioners in Southeast Asia. These revenues are not counted in Japan's GDP. The demographic doom model, which assumes Japan's economy is bounded by Japan's shrinking population, is measuring the wrong perimeter.
Here is the insight that explains why Japan has survived and will continue to survive the demographic transition that so many predicted would destroy it.
Demographic pressure is not just a problem, it is a forcing function. Japan's labor shortage has achieved something that 3 decades of monetary policy could not. It has forced wages up. The deflationary trap that haunted Japan from the 1990s onwards was partly sustained by wage stagnation. Workers accepted flat pay, companies held prices down, and the economy stayed stuck. Scarcity broke that cycle. Not policy, not stimulus, not quantitative easing. A shrinking supply of labor.
Japan is also the first developed economy to confront this challenge at scale. The demographic trends that Japan has been navigating since the 1990s, falling birth rates, rapid aging, shrinking working-age populations, are now arriving in Germany, South Korea and Italy. China's working-age population peaked in The United States is on a slower trajectory but the same curve.
Japan is not a cautionary tale, it is a field test, and the preliminary results suggest that developed economies can adapt to demographic decline without collapsing, through automation, through workforce expansion, through overseas corporate extension, and through the blunt economics of scarcity driving up the price of labor.
If you want to keep up with stories like this, subscribe to the Japan Factor. The question worth asking now is not whether Japan will survive its demographics, it is what Japan will look like when it reaches demographic equilibrium, a stable, smaller, more automated, higher wage economy, and whether the countries currently on the same trajectory will have learned anything from the 15 years Japan ran this experiment first.